Spring 1945. The Eastern Front was no longer a line of defense. It was a graveyard stretching from the Vistula to the Oder. The German army, once feared across Europe, had become a broken mass of exhausted men, starving horses, and rusting steel. Snow still clung to the forests of East Prussia, and through it stumbled columns of soldiers who no longer looked like soldiers at all. Their uniforms were torn, their eyes hollow. Every sound in the distance, an artillery shell, a Soviet tank engine, meant death creeping closer. For months they had been retreating. Entire divisions had vanished, swallowed by the Red Army's relentless advance. Communications had collapsed. Many officers no longer knew which units they commanded, or even where the front line truly was. Supply trains had been bombed to ruins, ammunition was gone, and soldiers were fighting with captured Soviet rifles. In the villages, civilians clung to their last possessions, waiting for the tide of war to pass over them. The Soviet offensive was like a storm without pause. T-34 tanks rolled through mud and snow, firing into fleeing convoys. Artillery thundered day and night, reducing towns to ashes. For German troops, there was nowhere left to fall back to. The Oder River, once promised as a final line of defense, was already breached in places. The sky was filled with the drone of Soviet aircraft, and any movement on the roads was met with fire. Among the chaos, rumors spread faster than orders. Some said the Führer had secret weapons that would turn the war around. Others whispered the truth, that Berlin itself was doomed. Officers tried to maintain discipline, but morale had shattered. A captain might shout for his men to hold the line, only to find half of them gone by nightfall. Entire battalions deserted, throwing away their insignias, their helmets, even their rifles, blending into refugee columns in a desperate attempt to survive. The scenes were biblical in scale. Endless lines of civilians pushed westward. Mothers pulling carts loaded with children, wounded soldiers dragging their bandaged legs, priests clutching crosses as the horizon burned behind them. The roads were packed so tightly that tanks could barely move. Every mile of retreat was marked by frozen bodies and abandoned weapons. Inside command bunkers, German generals argued over meaningless maps. The front no longer existed. Soviet forces were already bypassing strongholds, encircling entire army groups. Radio operators begged for orders from Berlin, but only static answered. When a message did come through, it was the same madness. Hold your ground. No retreat. Everyone knew it was suicide. In one shattered village near Kustrin, Major Karl Brenner gathered what remained of his regiment. Barely 200 men out of the 2,000 he had led 6 months earlier. They stood in the ruins of a church, snow falling through the open roof. "We have no artillery," Brenner said quietly. "No fuel. No contact with headquarters. The Russians will be here by morning." His men said nothing. Some stared at the floor, others looked at the sky as if searching for a way out. By dawn, the horizon was glowing red. The rumble of tanks grew louder, closer. Brenner gave the order to fall back, though he knew there was nowhere left to go. Soviet shells began to fall, tearing apart the remains of the village. Horses screamed, men shouted, and within minutes, the regiment ceased to exist. That morning was repeated hundreds of times across the Eastern Front. Cities like Königsberg, Danzig, and Breslau became fortresses, but even those fortresses bled out. The German army was no longer fighting to win. It was fighting to delay the inevitable. Every step west meant one more day of life, one more chance to reach the Americans instead of the Soviets. The collapse was total. Maps lost meaning. Orders lost authority. The Wehrmacht, once a symbol of discipline, had dissolved into fragments. And amid the smoke and snow, 500,000 men began to realize that their only way to survive was to stop fighting. The myth of invincibility was dead. The Eastern Front had consumed them all. By early April 1945, the remnants of the German army in the east were trapped. The Soviets had closed the ring around what was left of Army Group Vistula, encircling nearly 500,000 men between the Oder River and the approaching Red Army divisions. The sky above was blackened by smoke, and the ground beneath them was frozen with mud and blood. Inside that shrinking pocket, soldiers lived in a world without direction, without supplies, and without hope. Every road out was under Soviet control. What had once been escape routes were now corridors of death. Columns of trucks, wagons, and retreating soldiers were shredded by artillery fire. Soviet aircraft hunted anything that moved. The men had no air support, no reinforcements, no food except what they could steal from abandoned villages. Many units no longer had functioning radios. They fought blindly, guessing where the front was, praying that surrendering west might still be possible. The encircled divisions were a mixture of veterans and terrified teenagers. The old soldiers had seen this before: Stalingrad, Kharkov, the endless retreats across the steppe. But this time, there would be no airlift, no rescue. The new recruits, some barely 16, had never even fired a rifle in training. Now they crouched in trenches under constant bombardment, waiting for an enemy they could not see. Major Brenner's regiment, what was left of it, had fallen back to a cluster of ruined farmhouses outside Kustrin. The men were exhausted. They hadn't eaten in 2 days. The wounded lay in the barns without medicine or morphine, their moans muffled by gunfire. "We're surrounded," said Sergeant Muller, staring at the distant glow of burning villages. Brenner didn't answer. He knew the maps meant nothing now. There was no front line, only chaos. At night, the Soviets broadcast surrender appeals through loudspeakers. A woman's voice echoed through the darkness, calm and cold. "German soldiers, your leaders have abandoned you. Lay down your arms. You are surrounded. You will be treated humanely." The men listened in silence. Some cursed, others wept. A few clutched their rifles tighter, unable to decide whether to fight or flee. In the nearby forests, smaller groups of soldiers tried to break out. They moved silently through the trees, avoiding roads, using the stars for direction. But the Red Army was everywhere. Soviet patrols ambushed them, cutting them down with machine gun fire. Those who were captured were marched east into the unknown. By the third day of the encirclement, discipline had evaporated. Brenner's unit was reduced to scattered clusters of men hiding in basements, barns, and cellars. Ammunition was gone. Rations were gone. Horses were slaughtered for food. The officers no longer gave speeches about duty or victory. They spoke instead about survival. "If you can reach the west," Brenner whispered to his lieutenant, "do it. Don't wait for orders." The pocket began to collapse inward. The Soviets tightened the noose with artillery and tanks, advancing yard by yard. Villages were obliterated in minutes. Smoke covered the landscape like a shroud. The wounded who couldn't move were left behind. One soldier, barely 20, begged his comrades not to leave him. "Tell my mother I wasn't afraid," he said before the next barrage ended his voice forever. By April 10th, the encirclement was complete. Radio messages from Berlin still demanded resistance. "Hold the line. Reinforcements are coming." But everyone knew it was a lie. The only reinforcements that came were Soviet shells. Every position they took was reduced to rubble within hours. When Brenner finally ordered a breakout attempt, only 40 men followed. They moved under cover of darkness, crawling through mud and corpses, heading west. Flares lit the night sky. Machine guns opened up. By dawn, only a handful remained. Those who survived hid in the ruins of a railway yard, watching Soviet troops roll past in endless columns. Inside the pocket, the rest surrendered or died. Entire divisions ceased to exist. The radio signals fell silent, one after another, until there was nothing left but static. For the survivors, there was no victory, no escape, only the realization that they were forgotten. The Eastern Front had consumed another 500,000 souls. In the final weeks of the war, surrounded by fire and silence, they understood what their leaders never would: that courage could no longer change the outcome, and obedience could no longer save them. They were encircled not only by the enemy, but by the inevitable end of a war already lost. In the underground bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin, Adolf Hitler refused to see reality. It was April 1945. The Soviet armies were less than 30 kilometers away, and artillery shells could already be heard exploding across the city. The capital of the Reich was burning, but Hitler's voice on the radio remained steady and cold. His words carried through the static to the shattered remnants of the Wehrmacht. There will be no retreat. Any man who abandons his position is a traitor to Germany. For soldiers still trapped in the East, those words were a death sentence. Hitler demanded total resistance, even from divisions that no longer existed. Messages from Berlin ordered commanders to stand firm and defend every inch of ground. But there was no ground left to defend, only ruins and bodies. The lines had dissolved. The enemy was everywhere. Yet still the orders came. General Heinrichsey, commanding Army Group Vistula, had already seen enough. His troops were starving, exhausted, surrounded. He tried to send honest reports back to headquarters, requests to withdraw to save what men could be saved. But every message returned with the same phrase: hold position at all costs. Heinrichsey understood what that meant. It meant that Hitler preferred annihilation to retreat. Inside the encircled zones, these last orders arrived too late, carried by messengers who often died on the way. When the orders were finally read aloud, they were met with silence. Officers looked at each other, unwilling to enforce them. How could they tell starving, wounded soldiers to die for a city already lost? Some obeyed out of fear. Others quietly defied the command and began planning surrender. Major Karl Brenner received his final coded transmission on the night of April 12th. It came from a nearby field headquarters still pretending to function. The message read simply, "No step back. Death before surrender." Brenner stared at the paper for a long time, then folded it into his pocket. Around him, his men were asleep in the ruins of a farmhouse, wrapped in torn blankets. He knew he couldn't wake them to tell them this. He couldn't order more dying. Across the Eastern Front, similar scenes played out. Commanders destroyed their radios to avoid receiving further orders. Some changed uniforms, disguising themselves as medics or civilians. Others shot themselves rather than carry out Hitler's commands. The system that had once ruled with iron discipline was now crumbling from within. In Berlin, Hitler grew increasingly detached from reality. His maps still showed divisions that had been wiped out weeks earlier. He ranted about phantom armies that would soon counterattack. In one meeting, he demanded that Field Marshal Keitel order an offensive toward Kustrin, a city that no longer existed. His generals stood in silence, knowing it was madness. The last orders that left the bunker were filled with delusion and desperation. They demanded resistance from the old, the young, even from civilians. Boys from the Hitler Youth were handed rifles and sent into the streets. Elderly men from the Volkssturm were told to defend intersections with Panzerfausts. Entire families were executed for trying to flee the city. To disobey was treason. To obey was suicide. Meanwhile, in the field, soldiers like Brenner faced a choice no order could dictate: Each day they heard the Soviet artillery growing louder. Each night they saw the horizon lit by burning towns. They knew the war was lost. Yet they also knew that surrender to the Soviets could mean imprisonment, torture, or death. The only hope left was to reach the Americans. But Hitler's orders forbade it. Anyone caught retreating west would be shot by their own officers. By mid-April, Hitler's voice no longer inspired loyalty. It inspired silence. The radio speeches still promised miracles, but the soldiers had stopped listening. They had learned that the man in the bunker was no longer leading Germany. He was burying it. On April 20th, Hitler's birthday, he issued one of his final messages to the front. He demanded that all remaining units fight to the last bullet for the honor of the Reich. In the forests of Brandenburg, Brenner heard the words from a cracked field radio. He turned it off halfway through. The men around him stared into the darkness. No one spoke. By then, even the fanatics understood that the orders were meaningless. The empire was ashes, its armies gone, its leader isolated beneath a dying city. Still, the papers bearing his signature continued to circulate. Commands written in ink, delivered into the hands of soldiers covered in blood and mud. These were Hitler's last orders. Words sent into a void, demanding loyalty from men who had nothing left to give. They obeyed for 6 years. Now, finally, they began to disobey not out of betrayal but out of the simple human instinct to live. In the first weeks of April 1945, while Berlin descended into chaos, a small circle of German generals met in secrecy. They were men who had once sworn loyalty to Hitler without hesitation, commanders who had led victories across Europe. Now they sat in darkened rooms, surrounded by maps that no longer meant anything, facing a decision that could save 500,000 men or condemn them all to die. Among them was General Walter Wenck, commanding the 12th Army. His forces were one of the last organized formations still capable of movement. To the east, the 9th Army under General Theodor Bussy was trapped near the Oder River, surrounded by the Red Army. Between them lay thousands of broken soldiers, starving civilians, and a collapsing chain of command. Hitler's orders were clear: turn east, break the Soviet lines.
Relieve Berlin.
But the generals knew the truth: any attack toward Berlin would be suicide. The reality was simple. The 9th Army was doomed. Soviet divisions had sealed every road, and air superiority was total. If nothing was done, the entire pocket, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, would be wiped out. Wenck's choice was impossible. Obey Hitler's command and die, or disobey and save his men by surrendering to the Americans. He did not speak of it openly. Every word against Berlin could mean execution. SS officers still roamed the camps, listening for defeatism. So Wenck played the role of loyal commander. In his reports, he promised to advance east. In reality, he began secretly preparing a western withdrawal route, one that would carry as many troops as possible away from the Soviets and toward the Elbe River, where the Americans were advancing from the other side. Every night, coded messages were sent to trusted officers. They used phrases like repositioning for tactical efficiency, but everyone understood the meaning. The general was planning an escape, not a counterattack. Trucks were refueled, bridges secured, and maps marked with hidden routes through forests and abandoned villages. Meanwhile, inside the 9th Army pocket, General Bussy's men were collapsing. They were surrounded near Halby. Tens of thousands pressed into a shrinking circle under relentless artillery fire. Soviet tanks blasted through the woods, setting everything on fire. Wounded soldiers crawled through the mud, whispering prayers or names of families they would never see again. Bussy knew his situation was hopeless. Yet even as the world fell apart, the radio in his headquarters crackled with the same orders from Berlin. Stand and fight. Reinforcements coming. On April 23rd, Wenck received his final directive from the Führerbunker. Hitler's voice, weak and trembling, demanded that the 12th Army march east at once and crush the Soviet spearheads. Wenck saluted the order and ignored it. Instead, he turned his army west. His decision, made in silence, would save tens of thousands of lives. His officers understood what he was doing, but none dared speak it aloud. They moved in disciplined formation, pretending to obey. Behind the lines, the propaganda still spoke of victory through faith, but the soldiers no longer believed. They knew their general had chosen to defy the madness. At the same time, Bussy's trapped forces attempted a breakout toward Wenck's line. It was hell on earth. Soviet artillery blanketed the forests with fire. Thousands died every hour. Civilians mixed with soldiers in the chaos, women pushing carts, children clinging to the wounded. Those who managed to slip through the encirclement marched west through burning villages, guided by the faint hope of reaching the Americans. By April 27th, Wenck's columns met the first survivors from Bussy's army near Bielitz. They were ghosts in uniform, starved, half-deaf from shelling, eyes hollow from sleeplessness. "You made it," Wenck said quietly. The men could barely stand. They didn't salute. They simply nodded. Behind them, the east still burned. That night, Wenck gathered his senior officers in a farmhouse lit only by candles. "Our duty now," he said, "is to bring as many of them as possible across the Elbe. No more attacks. No more senseless orders." For the first time in years, he spoke without fear of Berlin's ears. The officers agreed. They would fight only to reach the Americans. While Hitler screamed in his bunker for reinforcements that no longer existed, his generals had already made their choice. They would not die for him. They would not sacrifice their men for pride or illusion. Wenck's secret defiance was not a rebellion born of politics. It was an act of humanity in a world stripped of it. As the days passed, columns of soldiers and refugees moved west under his protection. They left behind the burning fields, the wrecked tanks, the empty slogans. They no longer fought for the Reich. They fought for survival. On April 30th, as Hitler ended his life in Berlin, Wenck's army reached the Elbe River. Across the water, they saw American tanks waiting. The general gave one final order, simple, direct, and unlike any he had ever issued before: "Lay down your arms." For the men who followed him, that was not surrender. It was deliverance. In the final months of the war, Germany was no longer a nation. It was a battlefield. The front line had dissolved into the villages, forests, and roads where millions of civilians now fled for their lives. The thunder of artillery never stopped. The air stank of smoke, fuel, and fear. Every town from Königsberg to Dresden was filled with the same desperate scene. Soldiers retreating, refugees screaming, and the Red Army closing in from the east. They had been told for years that the Soviets were monsters, that capture meant death or worse. So entire families abandoned their homes in the middle of winter, pushing carts through the snow, carrying what little food they had left. Mothers wrapped babies in blankets torn from curtains. The elderly were pulled along on makeshift sleds. They followed the army west, believing the soldiers could protect them. But the soldiers themselves were broken and starving. There was no safety left. On the frozen roads, military convoys mixed with columns of civilians. Tanks rolled beside horse-drawn wagons. Wounded soldiers rode in the same carts as children. The chaos was endless. Soviet aircraft circled above, hunting targets of opportunity. They did not distinguish between soldiers and refugees. Machine guns ripped through the lines, scattering bodies across the snow. Survivors dove into ditches, holding their breath as bullets shredded the air. Major Karl Brenner's unit had been ordered to escort a group of refugees toward the Elbe. It was not an order from Berlin, it was a choice made by conscience. The soldiers no longer believed in the war. They only believed in getting people out alive. The column stretched for kilometers. Farmers, teachers, widows, children, and the last remains of the Wehrmacht walking side by side. Each day was the same nightmare repeated. In the morning, they marched under gray skies, moving silently past burned villages. In the afternoon, they hid from aircraft in the forests. At night, they slept in barns, hungry and cold. The cries of children never stopped. The soldiers gave away their last rations, some tearing their bread in half for strangers. Discipline was gone, but compassion returned. Behind them, the Soviet advance moved like a storm.
Village d'Issapir d'Auvernicht.
Houses were looted, men shot, women dragged away. The propaganda that once filled German radios had become real on the ground. The soldiers who had once been conquerors now watched helplessly as their own people suffered the same fate they had brought to others. The line between soldier and civilian had vanished. All were victims now. One evening near Halby, the column reached a crossroads littered with burned trucks. A Soviet shell exploded nearby, scattering the group. Brenner shouted for everyone to take cover. When the smoke cleared, a farmhouse was on fire, and inside it they heard screams. Without hesitation, a few soldiers ran into the flames. They carried out 2 children, both burned but alive. Their mother was gone. Brenner stood outside in the falling ash, unable to speak. He had commanded men in battle for years, but nothing had prepared him for this. In the villages still standing, desperation bred cruelty. Some locals refused to open their doors to refugees, fearing they would attract Soviet patrols. Others turned on each other, fighting over food or a place to sleep. German police units, once enforcing order for the Reich, now looted the same homes they had once protected. Morality had collapsed with the front line. Yet even in the ruins, moments of humanity survived. In one town near Belitz, an old priest opened his church to everyone, German, Polish, wounded soldier, or refugee. He tore the altar cloth into bandages and burned the pews for warmth. When Soviet artillery destroyed the church the next day, the survivors said he never left the altar. The refugees who managed to move west reached landscapes that looked like the moon. Fields cratered by bombs, roads lined with burned tanks and bodies. Every night, the horizon glowed red. The sound of artillery rolled like thunder that never ended. In that sound, children grew up instantly, mothers aged decades, and soldiers forgot what victory was supposed to mean. By late April, the streams of civilians had turned into rivers. Tens of thousands poured toward the Elbe River, where rumors said the Americans were waiting. Those who could still walk pushed forward. Those who couldn't were left behind. Death was so constant that people no longer looked at the bodies, they stepped over them. Brenner's column reached the edge of the forest just as the sun rose. They could see the faint reflection of the river in the distance. It was the first light of hope in months. Behind them, the distant echo of Soviet guns reminded them that it was not over yet. The civilians moved on, exhausted but alive. The soldiers followed, no longer as warriors but as escorts to the broken. The war had taken everything from them: faith, purpose, mercy. But in those final days, as they led the refugees westward, they found the last thing left to fight for. Not victory, not orders, but life itself. By the last week of April 1945, the Eastern Front no longer existed. What remained of the German army had become a desperate flood of men moving westward. Tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians, all driven by the same thought: reach the Americans before the Soviets arrive. The difference between surrendering to one or the other was the difference between life and death. Everyone knew what the Red Army did to those it captured. Everyone had heard the stories from East Prussia and Silesia, mass executions, looting, and revenge without mercy. The roads were packed beyond imagination. Columns of refugees stretched for kilometers, mixed with retreating soldiers, wounded men on carts, and stray livestock. Trucks without fuel were pushed by hand. Horses collapsed in the mud. The smell of smoke and decay clung to everything. Above them, Allied and Soviet aircraft hunted anything that moved. The sound of engines made everyone dive into the ditches, pressing their faces into the cold earth. Major Karl Brenner and his remaining men marched among them. Their uniforms were in tatters, insignias torn off, helmets replaced with caps taken from civilians. They no longer looked like soldiers of the Reich. They looked like survivors of a plague. Each of them carried a rifle not to fight, but to ward off bandits and deserters. The mission was simple: cross the Elbe River and surrender to the Americans. Nothing else mattered. Every rumor that spread through the column carried the weight of hope. The Americans are near Dessau. They're across the river at Magdeburg. They take prisoners fairly, they give food. Most of it was guesswork, but it didn't matter. Hope itself was enough to keep them walking. Behind them, the sound of Soviet artillery was constant. Every explosion was closer than the last. Brenner's men had learned to measure time not by hours, but by how far the shelling had moved. "If we stop for too long," one of them said, "we die in Russia." It wasn't a figure of speech. As they moved west, they passed what was left of entire divisions. Burned-out tanks, smashed field guns, and bodies littered the roadside. Some soldiers were so broken that they simply sat in the mud, staring at nothing, waiting for the Soviets to come. Others tried to flee with carts full of children. Every bridge they reached was packed with humanity. People screaming, pushing, praying to cross before the bombs fell. At one bridge near Wittenberg, Soviet aircraft attacked. The column scattered in seconds. Brenner threw himself over a child as machine gun fire tore through the wagons. The bridge caught fire. Screams echoed from the river below. When the attack ended, half the refugees were gone. The survivors picked up what was left and kept walking. There was no time to mourn. Further west, the Americans were moving too. Patrols from the U.S. Ninth Army had already begun to take prisoners by the thousands. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. German soldiers arriving in endless lines, unarmed, exhausted, begging to surrender. Some carried white flags made from torn bedsheets. Others simply raised their hands and dropped to their knees. For the German officers, surrender was not a tactical maneuver. It was treason in Hitler's eyes. But Hitler was already dead, even if most of them didn't yet know it. His empire was gone, his orders meaningless. All that remained was survival. Brenner's unit reached the outskirts of Dessau on April 30th. The city was a ruin, bridges destroyed, streets filled with rubble, the stench of death thick in the air. But across the river, they could see something extraordinary. Tanks with white stars painted on their hulls. American soldiers. For a moment, no one spoke. Some wept openly. Others simply stared, unable to believe they had made it. Brenner raised a white flag tied to his rifle and stepped forward. The men followed slowly, hands visible, rifles slung behind them. When they reached the riverbank, they shouted in broken English, "Don't shoot! Germans! Surrender!" From the opposite bank, an American officer lifted a megaphone. "Cross the bridge one group at a time. Weapons down." His voice was calm, firm. The Germans obeyed instantly. They crossed under the watching eyes of American troops, dropping rifles, pistols, and knives into piles that grew higher than men. On the other side, they were searched and processed. For the first time in months, someone handed them water, bread, and cigarettes. No shouting, no blows, just order and silence. Some of Brenner's men cried as they ate. They had not felt human in weeks. Behind them, the eastern sky still flickered with explosions. The Red Army was closing the last pockets. Thousands who hadn't reached the Americans would vanish into Soviet captivity. Years of labor, hunger, and punishment. But for those who had crossed the Elbe, the war was finally over. As night fell, Brenner sat by the river, staring at the wreckage of his uniform. Around him, prisoners slept in rows, too tired even to speak. Across the water, artillery flashes lit the horizon. He thought of the men who hadn't made it, of the civilians still on the roads, of the madness that had devoured everything. The race toward the Americans had not been a campaign, it had been an exodus. An entire army running from its own empire, from its own crimes, from its own end. And as the river reflected the last fires of the East, one truth became clear to every survivor there. They had not escaped the war. They had only lived long enough to remember it. In the first days of May 1945, the German army ceased to exist as a fighting force. The front lines had collapsed into chaos, and what had once been organized divisions turned into a tide of men moving west, driven by one instinct: survival. More than 500,000 soldiers poured toward the Elbe River, their destination the American lines. It was not an orderly retreat. It was a march of surrender. The roads of northern Germany were rivers of movement. Soldiers in faded uniforms, officers without commands, civilians with carts, horses, and whatever food remained. Entire units that had once fought on the Eastern Front now trudged alongside teenage recruits and wounded veterans. The silence of the march was broken only by the rumble of boots and the low murmur of fear. Every few kilometers, someone would whisper the same question: "Are the Americans still taking prisoners?" They marched through fields where the war had already passed. Burned vehicles and abandoned weapons lined the roads. The Luftwaffe was gone. The Wehrmacht was gone. All that was left were men with hollow eyes, carrying rifles they would never fire again. Some still clung to discipline, marching in formation. Others stumbled alone, detached from any command. The swastikas on their sleeves were torn away, the medals discarded. The once proud army of the Reich had become a shadow moving toward captivity. The American Ninth Army and British Second Army had set up massive temporary camps along the Elbe. They expected thousands of prisoners. What they received was a flood beyond imagination. By May 4th, columns stretched for kilometers, moving hour after hour under the white flags of surrender. Tanks and jeeps rolled past them, American soldiers watching in silence. The Germans kept their eyes low. No one wanted to speak. Major Karl Brenner's men were among them. They had made it across the Elbe and were now ordered to march toward an internment site near Gardelegen. The Americans instructed them to keep moving, single file, weapons dropped. Every few kilometers stood armed guards, silent but watchful. The prisoners were exhausted, but no one resisted. The thought of Soviet capture still haunted them. Even surrender felt like mercy compared to the alternative. Along the way, more columns joined, entire regiments that had laid down their arms. Some carried white armbands. Others held signs reading Kriegsgefangene, German prisoners. When they met American patrols, they stopped, raised their hands, and waited for orders. The Americans were efficient but cold. They didn't speak much. They simply pointed to the road and said, "Keep moving." In one field near Hagenau, over 60,000 men camped in open air. There were no tents, no shelters, only wire fences and dirt. They slept on the ground, wrapped in their coats, drinking rainwater from helmets. Each morning, the roll call began. Endless lines counted, sorted, and registered. Officers were separated from soldiers. Waffen-SS insignias were stripped immediately. Those who lied about their rank were discovered within hours. The Allied officers had learned how to spot deception. For many, the march didn't end at the Elbe. It continued westward toward massive holding zones, meadows and open fields hastily fenced with barbed wire. These became known as the Rheinwiesenlager, the Rhine meadow camps. The prisoners arrived in waves of thousands per hour. The Americans had no time to build proper barracks. The men slept under the sky, digging holes for shelter, eating whatever rations they were given. Despite exhaustion, there was an unspoken relief. They were alive. They had escaped the Red Army. Every night, the horizon to the east glowed with distant fire, the death of Berlin, the death of the Reich. To the west, there was quiet. No gunfire. No orders. Just the sound of breathing and the crackle of campfires. As the days passed, discipline eroded completely. Ranks meant nothing now. Generals and privates stood in the same food lines. Brenner watched as one of his sergeants traded an iron cross for a piece of bread. Another burned his uniform, saying, "This cloth killed too many." The symbols of the empire vanished into the dirt. The Americans processed each man carefully. Interrogations were short and direct. Name, rank, unit, and whether they had served in the SS. Anyone who hesitated was marked for questioning. Trucks came daily, collecting officers and specialists for transport to larger camps in France or Belgium. The rest remained behind barbed wire, waiting. One evening, as the sun fell over the Elbe, Brenner stood among thousands of prisoners watching an American convoy arrive. An officer climbed onto a jeep and shouted through a loudspeaker, "Germany has surrendered. The war is over." The crowd did not cheer. There was only silence, a silence deeper than anything the battlefield had ever known. Some fell to their knees, others simply stared into the distance. For years, they had fought for a cause that had promised victory or death. Now there was only surrender. The Reich that demanded loyalty to the last breath no longer existed. The men who had survived its collapse now faced an uncertain captivity, stripped of rank, power, and identity. The Great Surrender March became one of the largest movements of soldiers in modern history. An army not advancing, not retreating, but dissolving. It marked the true end of the war, not in gunfire, but in silence. Over 500,000 German soldiers laid down their arms and walked into captivity. For them, this march was not defeat. It was deliverance. They had crossed from the madness of ideology into the fragile space of survival. As they stood under the cold stars, surrounded by wire and strangers, one thought united them all. At least we are still alive. At 2:41 a.m. on May 7, 1945, in a small schoolhouse in Reims, France, the German High Command signed the instrument of unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. The signatures were simple strokes of ink, but behind them lay a continent reduced to ashes and more than 60 million dead. For those still scattered across Germany's fields and roads, the moment of capitulation did not come with triumph or ceremony. It came as silence, exhaustion, and disbelief. In the shattered towns of northern Germany, American soldiers received the news through radio transmissions before sunrise. All German forces are to cease operations immediately, the message read. Commanders relayed it down the line. No more firing, no more patrols. The sound of gunfire that had echoed for years faded into stillness. The last battles on the Elbe stopped mid-movement. Soldiers who had been crouched behind walls lifted their heads and looked at each other, uncertain whether to trust the words. For Major Karl Brenner and his men, held in a temporary American camp near Gardelegen, the announcement arrived at noon. An officer read it aloud in English, then again in broken German. The German army has surrendered. All hostilities have ceased. The prisoners stood motionless, mud-caked and hollow-eyed. Some blinked, as if trying to absorb the meaning. Others simply sat down in the dirt. There was no cheering. The war that had consumed their entire existence had ended not with a roar, but with a whisper. Outside the camp fences, the countryside was still burning. Farmhouses smoldered, bridges lay in ruins, and roads were filled with columns of displaced civilians. The official surrender did not stop hunger or disease. It did not erase the guilt that hung over the defeated nation. For most Germans, capitulation meant the beginning of reckoning. Not peace, not yet. In Flensburg, near the Danish border, Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, now the nominal head of what remained of the German government, broadcast a message across the airwaves. The German Wehrmacht has surrendered, he declared. The purpose of this act is to save German lives. His tone was cold, administrative, stripped of ideology. But everyone knew it was the final confirmation that the Third Reich had ceased to exist. For the Allied forces, the response was measured discipline. American and British troops watched the German prisoners with quiet efficiency. The chaos of combat gave way to a new kind of order, registration, classification, processing. Every man was tagged, recorded, and sent to camps. In many cases, soldiers who had fought each other only days before now exchanged brief, silent glances through barbed wire. The victors showed no hatred, only control. Inside the German camps, the mood was surreal. Soldiers who had followed orders to the bitter end now sat on the ground, uncertain what to do with their hands, their thoughts, their memories. The Nazi salutes were gone. The oaths meant nothing. Brenner noticed a young corporal staring at the sky, whispering, "So it's really over." Another muttered, "We gave everything, and it gave us nothing." The officers who had once commanded entire divisions were now powerless. Their authority vanished the moment they stepped behind wire. They received the same rations, slept on the same dirt, and stood in the same lines as privates. In that leveling, the ideology that had consumed a nation began to crumble. The surrender was not just military, it was moral collapse. News of Hitler's death reached them only days before. Some had doubted it, assuming it was Allied propaganda. But as American guards confirmed it, disbelief turned into a heavy, wordless acceptance. The man whose voice had dominated every radio, whose orders had driven millions to their graves, had chosen to end his life in a bunker rather than face what his soldiers were now enduring. For many, that knowledge stung deeper than defeat. Across Europe, the reaction to capitulation varied by hour and place. In London and New York, crowds filled the streets. Church bells rang, flags waved, and strangers embraced. In Moscow, artillery salutes thundered in victory. But in Germany, there was nothing to celebrate. Cities were graves of concrete and ash. Families searched the ruins for missing fathers and sons. The word Frieden, peace, felt foreign, almost mocking. For the Allied soldiers, the end of the war revealed the full weight of what they had fought against. As they advanced deeper into Germany, they discovered camps: Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen. The photographs of emaciated prisoners and mass graves spread through the ranks. Many who had once pitied the German captives now felt only a grim understanding of justice. The war had ended, but its horror had only begun to be understood. That night, Brenner sat near the edge of the camp fence, listening to the distant murmur of men too tired to speak. Somewhere beyond the river, he could hear church bells ringing for the first time in years. They did not sound like victory, they sounded like a requiem. He thought of the soldiers who had refused to surrender and had been swallowed by the East. He thought of the civilians who had vanished in the bombings, the ideals that had turned to dust. In that stillness, the truth became inescapable. The moment of capitulation was not just the end of a war, it was the death of an illusion. The belief in invincibility, in destiny, in the righteousness of conquest, All of it ended with one signature on a paper in a French schoolhouse. For the men behind the wire, there was no applause, no redemption, only silence and the slow return of humanity. They had become prisoners not of an enemy, but of history itself. And as night fell over the quiet fields of Germany, the great noise of war that had once drowned out conscience faded at last into the sound of the wind. The war was over, but for millions of German soldiers, the nightmare had only changed its shape. Across Europe, the victors faced an impossible task, handling the largest mass surrender in modern history. More than 7 million German troops laid down their arms in May 1945. For them, the end of fighting did not bring freedom. It brought captivity. The Allied powers had anticipated a flood of prisoners, but not on this scale. The roads, fields, and bridges were already overflowing with exhausted men. Many half-starved, limping, or wounded. Entire divisions arrived without officers, holding white flags made from torn uniforms. The Americans called them disarmed enemy forces rather than prisoners of war. The difference in terminology changed everything. It meant they were not protected under the Geneva Convention in the same way as traditional POWs. Temporary enclosures were established all over Western Germany. The most infamous were the Rheinwiesenlager, the Rhine meadow camps. These were not prisons in the usual sense. They were open fields surrounded by barbed wire, hastily organized to contain hundreds of thousands. No barracks, no roofs, just mud, rain, and hunger. In the first weeks after surrender, food was scarce. The Allied supply chains were stretched, and priority went to liberated nations and concentration camp survivors. The German soldiers, once conquerors, were now the lowest on the list. Major Karl Brenner and his men were moved to one such camp near Remagen. It was a wasteland of humanity. The ground was already a swamp from spring rain, and the men dug holes with helmets to sleep in. Each morning, they lined up for a ration of thin soup and a piece of bread. The weak collapsed in line and were dragged aside. Disease spread quickly, dysentery, fever, and infection. There were no doctors, no medicine, only resignation. Guards patrolled the perimeter in silence. Most were American soldiers who had fought in the Ardennes or Normandy and wanted nothing more than to go home. They followed orders. No escape, no fraternization. But even they were unprepared for what they saw. Tens of thousands of defeated men, stripped of everything, waiting in the mud for an uncertain fate. For Brenner, the days merged into a blur. There was no calendar, no news, only rumors. Some said they would be released soon. Others whispered they would be handed over to the French or the Soviets. The fear of being transferred east haunted everyone. Those who had served on the Eastern Front prayed silently that the Americans would keep them. At night, when the floodlights swept across the camp, men whispered about their pasts, about the villages they left behind, the families they might never see again. Some still tried to justify the war. Others cursed it. The older soldiers stared blankly, knowing that everything they had fought for had vanished. The younger ones wept quietly, realizing they had been used and discarded. In the following weeks, Allied investigators began separating the prisoners by category: Wehrmacht, Waffen-SS, Luftwaffe, Kriegsmarine. Officers were interrogated for information on war crimes. SS members were marked for transfer. Those who had served near concentration camps or in anti-partisan units faced harsher scrutiny. Some tried to hide their past, burning papers or switching tags with the dead. But the truth often surfaced. Too many people remembered. The American command did not seek revenge, but the sheer scale of the situation created neglect. Food shortages, lack of sanitation, and overcrowding led to thousands of deaths across the Rhine camps. By summer, the worst conditions began to ease as the Allies stabilized the supply lines. International observers, including the Red Cross, were eventually allowed to deliver aid. By late 1945, many prisoners were relocated to labor camps in France, Belgium, and the United Kingdom. They rebuilt what their armies had destroyed: bridges, roads, farms. Others were shipped as far as the United States and Canada, working under supervision until repatriation. For many, captivity lasted years. Some would not return to Germany until 1948 or even 1949. Inside the camps, time lost all meaning. Brenner marked days by counting the bread rations. When it rained, the mud reached the knees. When it froze, the earth turned to stone, and the wind cut through their rags. Yet, in that bleak monotony, something began to change. The soldiers stopped thinking as Germans or Nazis or Aryans. They began to think simply as men, hungry, broken, alive. One evening, Brenner sat near the fence, watching the sunset over the Rhine. Beyond the wire, he could see children playing near a ruined farmhouse, German children, free. For the first time in years, he felt no orders pressing on him, no ideology whispering in his ear, only silence. He realized the war had taken everything: his comrades, his country, his beliefs, but in losing them, he had also escaped them. The Allied guards started calling them by number, not by name. Brenner didn't mind. Numbers could not be lied to. Names carried too much history. Each morning, more men were processed and sent away, their faces empty, their futures uncertain. The camp grew quieter. The cries, the fights, even the prayers began to fade. What remained was endurance. When word finally came that some prisoners would be released, no one celebrated. They packed what little they had: a spoon, a piece of cloth, a photo if they were lucky. They left behind graves marked with sticks, uncounted and unnamed. They had entered the camp as soldiers. They walked out as remnants of a lost world. For those who survived the Rhine camps, the memory never left. The hunger, the waiting, the humiliation. It burned deeper than battle ever had. They had fought for a Reich that promised glory and delivered only captivity. Yet, within that captivity, they rediscovered something long buried under uniforms and slogans: the simple, brutal truth of being human. The war had ended, but for its prisoners, the silence that followed would echo for the rest of their lives. The war had been over for months, but for millions of Germans scattered across ruined Europe, peace did not feel like deliverance. It felt like aftermath. Cities lay in ashes, borders had vanished, and entire families were missing. For the men who had survived captivity, there was no homecoming, only return to a country that no longer existed. Major Karl Brenner was among the thousands released from American custody in late 1946. He stepped out of the camp gates thinner by half, his uniform replaced by civilian rags, his body scarred from illness and hunger. Around him, the countryside of Western Germany looked unrecognizable. Villages were half buried in rubble, roads cracked, bridges gone. The people who passed him in silence were hollow-eyed, their faces gray with soot and defeat. He made his way toward his hometown near Kassel, traveling by foot and rail when trains still ran. Along the roads, he saw women digging through ruins for food, children carrying water from craters that had once been streets. Allied occupation posters hung on every wall, warnings against black market trade, orders to surrender weapons, lists of curfews. The Reich was not only dead, its memory was forbidden. When he reached what had once been his home, he found only foundations. The air still smelled faintly of ash. His wife and daughter were gone, evacuated in 1944, never heard from again. No one in the village knew their fate. For hours, he stood in silence among the ruins, unable to cry. He had survived the front, the surrender, and the camp, but not this. Survival, he realized, did not mean life. It meant remaining to face what was lost. All across Germany, men like Brenner wandered the wreckage, searching for names, faces, and meaning. Some tried to rebuild, others drank themselves into oblivion. The Allied forces began the process of denazification, removing symbols, burning books, interrogating those who had served the regime. Many were banned from teaching, working in government, or wearing uniforms of any kind. The once proud officers now stood in ration lines beside the civilians they had once commanded. In 1947, Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. The new borders carved the nation apart, just as the war had carved its people. Families were split by lines drawn on maps. In the Soviet zone, suspicion ruled. In the West, survival depended on cooperation with the occupiers. For many, shame became the new uniform. Brenner found work clearing debris in Kassel. Day after day, he hauled bricks from the ruins of buildings once built for the Reich. The irony was not lost on him. He was rebuilding the same cities he had once helped destroy through obedience. But in the rhythm of labor, something began to shift. He worked beside women, orphans, and former soldiers from every rank. No one asked about the past. The silence among them was heavy, but it was a shared silence, the only thing that united them. At night, he would sit near the river, listening to the sound of hammers in the distance. New structures were rising where ashes had once been. It was not redemption, but repetition. The slow, unheroic act of surviving another day. The Reich had taught men to worship death for honor. Now they learned the quiet discipline of living without it. Letters began arriving at the reconstruction office. Lists of the dead, survivors from camps, missing persons. One day, Brenner received a torn envelope from a refugee center in Munich. His wife, Anna, had survived. She had fled west after the bombings, working in a hospital for displaced civilians. Their daughter, Lotte, had died of typhus in 1945. The words were simple, factual, written by Anna herself. There was no sentiment, no anger, only acknowledgement. When they met months later, they did not embrace. They simply stood facing each other, the distance between them heavier than years of separation. War had made them strangers, yet in that silence there was understanding. They were both survivors of the same collapse, bound not by love alone, but by endurance. In 1948, the Berlin airlift began. For the first time, Germans watched American planes drop food instead of bombs. Children waved at them from the streets. The sound of engines overhead no longer meant fear, it meant survival. A generation that had grown up under dictatorship was now learning democracy through hunger, ration cards, and rebuilding. For Brenner, survival began to take on a different meaning. It was not the absence of death, nor the avoidance of punishment. It was the act of remembering without surrendering to despair. He began writing letters to the families of men from his old unit, telling them where their sons had fallen, how they had lived. It was his way of reclaiming a fragment of dignity from a past consumed by lies. He often visited the graves of unknown soldiers near Kassel. The markers were simple wooden crosses, unnumbered, unnamed. He would stand there for hours, not praying, not speaking, just breathing. Those who had died had escaped guilt and shame. Those who lived had inherited both. That was the cost of survival. By 1950, West Germany had begun to recover. Streets were repaired, factories reopened, and children returned to schools. The war had shifted from memory to lesson, but for those who had lived it, the wounds never closed. Brenner, now an old man by appearance though barely 40, watched a new Germany rising from the ruins. It was a country without parades, without slogans, without certainty, and perhaps that was its greatest strength. He understood finally what survival meant. It was not about victory or endurance alone. It was about witnessing, about carrying memory forward so that those who had died in darkness were not erased by silence. To survive was to remember, and to remember was to rebuild not what was lost but what must never be repeated. The war had ended 5 years ago, but for men like Brenner, its echo never faded. They were the living reminders of a time when humanity had fallen to its lowest depths and crawled back inch by inch. In the ruins of their conscience, among the bones of a dead empire, they found the only truth left worth keeping: that survival is not a gift. It is a burden, and a duty to those who did not return.